Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is using AVERT to estimate the emissions benefits of clean energy policies and programs. And our host today is Warren Leon. He's the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And this webinar is being brought to you by the State Federal RPS Collaborative, which is a project of CESA. And before we get started, I would like to go over a quick housekeeping slide. So all of our participants today are in listen-only mode. This means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to connect with the audio portion of our webinar. You can join in using your telephone, or you can use your computer, mic, and speakers, and you can follow the instructions on your screen and on your webinar console for those options. Now, for our webinar today, we are encouraging all of our participants to please submit your questions at any point during the webinar. Type them in while you think of them. You can type them into the questions box on your webinar console and hit send. We will be reading those throughout the webinar, and we'll be having a Q&A following our presentations today, and we will get to as many questions as we can. My final note is that this webinar is being recorded, and you will find a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides, as well as all of our previous webinars for CESA archived on the CESA website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Well, CESA is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations that work together to advance clean energy. You can see all our members here from across the country, and in addition to working with our members on activities aimed at their interests, we coordinate the State Federal RPS Collaborative, as you'll see in the next slide. And the State Federal RPS Collaborative is an initiative funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. And this is an opportunity for state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, anybody else in the private sector who's interested in renewable portfolio standards to learn about them. And we advance dialogue and learning about RPS programs. We put together joint projects. We have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for free, and if you're interested in doing that, you can go to the web page that's listed on the screen here. So if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to jump right into today's topic because I think we have a very nifty tool to show you that will be of use to many of you, and we have two speakers who will be talking about it. That's Robyn DeYoung and Jeremy Fisher. I'm going to give you short bios of both of them now, and then we'll turn things over to them. And at the end of their presentations, as Samantha had mentioned, there will be time for questions. So as you think of questions during the presentations, type them in. In any case, Robyn DeYoung has worked at US EPA for over 5 years in the state and local climate and energy programs area. And she primarily focuses on the nexus between state energy efficiency and renewable energy programs and Clean Air Act requirements. In 2012, Robyn was a lead co-author of EPA's roadmap on incorporating clean energy in state implementation plans. She holds a BA in Environmental Science and an MA in Energy and Environmental Analysis from Boston University. And the reason she's on the call today is that she was the EPA project leader for the AVERT tool that we're going to be hearing about. Now let me tell you about Jeremy. Jeremy Fisher is a principal associate at Synapse Energy Economics, which is a research and consulting firm that specializes in energy, economic, and environmental topics. His work focuses on electric utility resource planning, the impact of environmental regulations on the electric sector, air emissions, the development of long-term alternative energy plans, and the development of analytical tools. He holds an MS and a PhD in geological sciences from Brown University and has bachelor's in geography and geology from the University of Maryland. Now, on behalf of EPA, he led the development of AVERT, and now he supports it. So that's our cast of characters, and with that, I will turn it over to them to tell you about AVERT and demonstrate it.
Great, thank
you,
Robyn,
Warren. You're on.
Thank you very much, Warren. I want to thank everyone for listening in today to hear about EPA's tool called the Avoided Emissions and Generation Tool, known as AVERT. And we released AVERT in February of 2014 and have gotten excellent response from the community on using AVERT with over 450 downloads since last year. So I'm very excited to tell you about the tool today. And I'm going to advance the slides here. Great, and so you heard about both of our bios. I'll be talking first, and then Jeremy will be taking the lead after that, and he'll walk through how to use the tool and demonstrate that for you live. And as Warren said, I work in US EPA's State and Local Climate Energy Program, and before coming to EPA, I was at the Ohio EPA for over 3 years, so I have state experience in doing a lot of emissions and energy work. Well, this story of AVERT starts in 2009, where EPA, the leaders at EPA wanted to renew our effort to encourage and remove barriers of estimating the emission impacts of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and combined heat and power. This is when I first started here. We got a call from the Associate Administrator in the Office of Air and Radiation, who happened to be Gina McCarthy at the time. She brought us into her office for a meeting, and she asked us if we could look for ways to make it easier to include emission benefits of EERE and CHP so that states could meet their clean air goals using these cost-effective programs. And we knew that states have been asking for clearer guidance on how to do this. And one of the primary goals that we learned from that, after that meeting, is EPA should be sending the message that energy efficiency, renewable energy, and combined heat and power are viable and cost-effective emission reduction strategies that states can use for Clean Air Act compliance. And at the time, we were looking to see what would be a good way to send that message, and so we focused our efforts on the air quality plans, also known as state implementation plans for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And what we recognized is that there was a tremendous opportunity, and there still is today, on capturing the air quality and emission benefits from energy efficiency and renewable energy policies. As EPA continues to protect public health and the environment, as we promulgate new national ambient air quality standards, state air quality planners continue to look for new and innovative ways to reduce emissions and improve air quality. And on the top right-hand side, you can see that the counties where there's the measured ozone concentration that's above the proposed range of the new standards that will be finalized by the end of the year. And meanwhile, on the energy side of things, you have the public utility commissions and state energy offices. A number of you on the call today are doing an excellent job of advancing proven energy efficiency and renewable energy policies and programs so that you can reach your clean energy goals and spur job growth and economic growth in your state. So the convergence of these two, clean air and clean energy initiatives, creates this crystal clear opportunity for states to include the emission benefits in clean air plans and also in other clean air goals that are coming down the pipe, like CO2, or something that you all are probably thinking about, the Clean Power Plan. But taking us back to 2012, we released a roadmap called Roadmap for Incorporating Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy in State Implementation Plans, affectionately known as EERE-SIP Roadmap. It's less of a mouthful. And after releasing that, we still heard from states that we still hadn't really removed that barrier, the key barrier of emission quantification of the energy impacts. So that's when AVERT was born. We said we really need to do more. And the goal was to address that key challenge associated with quantifying the emission benefits of energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. Because the truth is, it's not easy to do this quantification because of the integrated nature of the power system. It does make it difficult to do this emissions to generation. And, you know, the changes in emissions does vary based on whether you're doing energy efficiency or whether you're doing wind installation or solar installation. What AVERT does is it translates the energy savings and renewable energy generation of state energy efficiency, renewable energy programs, or regional programs into emission reductions, and it can be used for the NAAQS compliance. So if you have an ozone or a PM 2.5 NAAQS and you want to use energy efficiency, renewable energy to as a part of your strategy, you can use AVERT to do that quantification. And AVERT's an Excel-based tool, so it's highly accessible, and it allows users to analyze the emission benefits, and Jeremy will show you how to do that in a few minutes. And you can do that. You can look at the regional level, the state level, the county level, and even the EGU level. And we built AVERT to be straightforward, transparent, and credible. And we also had a robust peer review process. We benchmarked AVERT against an industry standard dispatch model called ProSim, and we also had states beta test the tool so that it would be as user-friendly as possible. Many people ask about where AVERT lies within the spectrum of quantification methods, and I'll start with the left-hand side basic method. I think a number of you are familiar with eGrid. It's another EPA database that has the emissions and generation of virtually all of the U.S. power plants. And eGrid is a great way to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation. eGrid is a driver behind many EPA tools like Portfolio Manager, our Greenhouse Gas Equivalency Calculator, among many others. And I say that using eGrid is great depending on what your purpose is. If you're looking for a regional emissions rate, and it doesn't matter whether you care if it's energy efficiency or renewable energy, and you're looking at something historical, because right now the most recent data is from 2010. I know 2012 should be out fairly soon. Then eGrid is a great method. But if you need to get down to the local level and understand those impacts, or if you want to understand, well, what if I did energy efficiency versus, well, what if I do solar or wind, then eGrid can't answer that question. And then if you go all the way to the right-hand side, the most sophisticated method is energy modeling, electric sector power modeling. And these types of modeling are clearly gold standard because you can project out into the future 5, 10, 20 years or more, and you can look at a number of different user constraints. You can look at economic parameters or whatever you want to analyze. These power sector models can do that and tell you what the future might hold. However, on the flip side, we understand, you know, from a state perspective or a perspective where you don't have a lot of resources and you don't have a lot of money to pay for either consultants doing this analysis for you or doing it yourself, then this option might not be possible. So AVERT is really an intermediate approach. It's a balance in between both of them. What AVERT does is it does take historical information. The most recent year on our website right now is from 2014. We update it every year. And you can take the most recent data, 2014, and you can do a number of different analysis using this Excel-based framework. And you can compare the difference between energy efficiency, solar, and wind. However, there are some limitations with AVERT where it doesn't project out into the future to 20, 30 years. And there aren't any transmission constraints involved with the tool as the energy model. And you know, sometimes it's in the noise when you use small or local programs, so AVERT might not be fit for that, but you might want to use eGrid for that type of situation. So AVERT does play a role in the emission quantification spectrum, and we find it right in the middle way. Well, how would you want to use AVERT? Well, here are some of the different applications that we suggest people might want to use AVERT for. We have, obviously, SIP credit for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which I've mentioned, of course, in concurrence with our regional offices, because they're the ones that approve those. You could analyze the NOx, SO2, or CO2 emission impacts of a portfolio of programs. Jeremy will show you how you can look at different programs and add them up so that you can see how EE, solar, and wind all together might change your electric system. Or you can do a comparison between energy efficiency versus solar versus wind. You can identify the location of the emission reductions, which I've mentioned earlier. You could promote, if you wanted to do some promotion of emission benefits of what you're doing in your state, we have a number of easy-to-interpret maps and charts. One caveat is that this tool is not a projection tool. We're using historical data to discern which EGUs or electric generating units are on the margin, and so it's not intended for analysis for further than 5 years out from the baseline period, because as you know, the electric power sector is changing, and AVERT wouldn't be able to represent those massive changes in the future or economics that might be changing. And then my last slide before I send you off to Jeremy is some examples of how others have been using AVERT. And I encourage you, if you have been using AVERT, and we would love to hear about what you guys are doing, just so that we can promote the AVERT and show how people are benefiting from this EPA tool. So the American Wind Energy Association put out a report called The Clean Air Benefits of Wind Energy. They showed what the CO2 emission benefits are of wind installations from 2013 across the nation. Maine Public Utility Commission just released a report on the valuation of distributed solar in their state, and they used AVERT as one of the key inputs. The Alliance to Save Energy created a carbon count calculator, which is a quantitative carbon scoring system that creates a metric to evaluate green bond investments in U.S.-based energy efficiency and renewable energy programs resulting from at least $1,000 of investment or more. And then we just released a regional comparison of wind, solar, and energy efficiency programs across the U.S. and presented that at the EPA Emissions Inventory Conference in April. And Jeremy will show you a few of those results. The Ozone Advanced program, state and local governments who are trying to stay out of non-attainment of the ozone standard, have been using AVERT to estimate the emission benefits of their voluntary programs. And then we've been working with DOE and the Pacific National Lab on a new tool that they're looking at to develop emission and benefits of smart grid technologies. So we'd love to hear from you, and looking forward to the questions, and I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Robyn. So I'm going to give a brief walkthrough of what AVERT is conceptually doing in the background and what it's designed to do. Then give a very brief walkthrough of sort of a case study that we did recently using AVERT, just to give an idea of how it works for different regions and what types of outputs we're getting out of it and interested in. And then I'm going to walk through a demonstration, and I think then after that we'll be able to go through questions about any of the above that we've gone through. So AVERT is trying to answer this question of which electric generating units respond to changes in load reduction. That's really the fundamental core question. And as Robyn said, there are sophisticated modeling mechanisms of trying to answer this question through usually proprietary industry standard models, and then there are fairly simplified mechanisms. Those simplified mechanisms usually rely on historic data sets. So we're going to try to tap into those rich historic data sets and get a fair bit more information out of it previously. And I apologize if there's a little static on the line. So we're tapping into a rich data set from EPA's Clean Air Markets Division, and we're going to gather statistics on unit operations under specific load conditions. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So the model itself is divided between a statistical core and that most users actually won't end up working with, and then a user interface that most users will. So we think of AVERT as an operational simulation model. It's trying to effectively put together what the grid looked like in terms of operations at any given time based on total load requirements and how generators responded to those load requirements. And just to dig into where we're trying to go with this, over on the left side, what you see is a conceptual loading order on the top left. And that's a series of generators who are stacked by effectively dispatch cost and their variable cost of operation. More expensive units are dispatched later in the sequence. The less expensive units are dispatched first. And so as our load goes up and down on a daily basis, the more expensive units are operated middle of the day. Normally, a simulation model would depend on using economic information about individual generators. In this case, we're actually looking back at how generators have actually responded to load in the past and then trying to project forward based on that piece of information. And what we can do is, if we were to do the example of removing a chunk of a solar profile from one of these loading orders, for example, the question would then be, which units backed off in order to be able to make space for the new solar energy coming into this space. And so then we are left with displaced generation, which is in this case down here on the bottom. This is a solar profile and the generators that have been displaced in order to make room for that solar profile. Now, in this case, this is a highly, highly simplified schematic. This isn't actually what the system really looks like, but it's trying to give an idea of what's actually happening a little bit behind the scenes and what AVERT will be trying to capture. And so AVERT will be trying to capture specifically which units back off in order to be able to make space. The underlying data, of course, behind AVERT and that's collected by EPA's Clean Air Markets Division is significantly more detailed and complex. This is just a two-dimensional image where you're looking at a color map of generation from all of the units that are collected in this data set. The SEMS data is reported by state air agencies, tends to be fossil generators greater than 25 megawatts, usually non-cogenerators. And so what you're seeing here are the approximately 4,600 generators in the data set over 8760 hours of the year. And the color is the intensity of how much they're actually producing per hour. Those notches see that units ramp up and down on a daily basis. Larger units are more brightly colored in this sequence. This is just to show that there's really just a lot of data that we're going to be tapping into and to show where that's coming from. AVERT divides the U.S. into 10 separate subregions. These are thought of in AVERT as effectively autonomous electrical regions. They are, of course, interconnected, except really across the east-west boundary between the western interconnect and the eastern interconnect, and very limited between Texas and the eastern interconnect. So there are better connections, of course, between these regions, but AVERT thinks of them as electrically autonomous hard boundaries. These are roughly based on EIA's electricity market module regions, and roughly similar to NERC's regions as well. They're aggregates of eGrid subregions. AVERT takes that raw data that we were looking at just a couple moments ago from the Clean Air Markets data set and ingests it through going to the right over here, this AVERT Statistical module. The AVERT Statistical module is where the heavy lifting of AVERT happens. It takes the hourly data set, performs statistical analyses on those that I'd be more than happy to talk about later, and runs a Monte Carlo analysis on it to try to determine how much on average each unit is generating at any specific level of regional load. So at higher levels of load, lots of units are generating. At lower levels of load, just some units are generating. This tries to put together the average at each one of those levels of load and the amount of emissions from each one of those units as well. That information is distilled down into these regional data files. And those regional data files are then what's made available on EPA's website to you as a user, and are the ones that are ingested into the AVERT main module, which is a mechanism for examining specific energy efficiency and renewable energy load curves. Users are able to go back to the original data and also re-ingest that through a mechanism. We've provided this statistical module for users to use as well. And the reason that a user might want to do that is to use what we call the future year scenario template, which is a modification to the statistical module. This is if you think you'd like to look at what a system might look like 3 or 4 years from now, but you know that there are going to be additional units online, there are going to be some units that are retired, some units might have emissions controls, and in order to be able to account for those changes, you'd want to make some core fundamental changes to the fleet before understanding what their statistics actually look like. And so that can be done through the future year scenario template. For example, if you're using this last year's worth of data to project what 2017 displaced emissions might look like, you might want to take into account the MATS retirements that are happening this year and possibly a number of retrofits that are happening in accordance with MATS as well. And then that would allow you to get a better handle on what the system actually looks like relative to those future year changes. Again, most users will really only need the regional data files that are provided by default from EPA and the AVERT main module to calculate those emissions. You have a quick example of where this actually starts to come in handy. This is a case study that we ran recently with EPA. And just looking at an array of different energy efficiency and renewable energy resources in AVERT's 10 regions. So what we're going to do is, in this brief case study, look at which resources are most effective at avoiding oxides of nitrogen and which are most effective at avoiding CO2 emissions, and which particular regions are more responsive. Are there different types of programs that we should be targeting at different regions in order to get different types of emissions reductions that are more effective than others? So we ran 4 different profiles that all in each region use the same amount of energy or displace the same amount of energy, but just at different times of day. So here's a load shape example of what we call portfolio energy efficiency, which follows approximately the same type of load shape as is actually being output by generators. A base load energy efficiency mechanism, which is just flat, straight energy efficiency coming online. A wind profile, which is an agglomeration of a number of modeled sites throughout a particular region, and then a solar photovoltaic system, which would be the equivalent of a number of PV panels at both utility and home sites. The information that we'll then be looking at, of course, strongly depends on the fuel mix, or the fossil fuel mix, in each one of the regions. And what we'll tend to see in just a moment is that regions that are more coal-heavy fractionally will be ones that have a better response characteristic to displaced emissions for CO2, and that some of the ones that have higher gas, and particularly higher oil as well, will be a little bit more responsive on NOx emissions, particularly with peaking profiles. So when we look at approximately a 3% penetration of energy efficiency in renewable energy for CO2 and NOx, we get different amounts of efficacy for different regions. So over on the left, for example, we see avoided NOx emissions by a particular portfolio. This, in this case, is a portfolio energy efficiency. And on the right, we see avoided CO2. And in this case, these are pretty closely correlated with the fuel mix that's below. And this is the type of information that we can get out of AVERT on a regional basis. And I'm going to actually blow through this other slide a little bit faster so we can get through the demonstration. But really, we can then start to parse out on a region-by-region basis which type of programs are better at avoiding which types of emissions, and start to look at some of the different patterns that we get across those types of sequences. And this is all put together in a paper that we're certainly able to send you a draft of, and is expected to get published fairly soon. So feel free to ask for it later. And at that, I think I'm going to move into the demonstration so that we have time for questions, if there are any. So right now, you're looking at the main module of AVERT. This can be pulled directly from EPA's website. Robyn gave you the website that you can go to earlier. It's www.epa.gov/AVERT. And right there, you'll see a series of steps to get you to the main module. You would pull the main module, and when you open it, you pop open this screen. You'll see that it's a little bit of a cleaner version than what you'd normally see in Excel. By default, when you enable the macros to get this started, it clears out some of the extraneous stuff in Excel. If you wanted to see the other stuff that you normally see in Excel because you're more comfortable looking that way, you just click on this little button and it says restore everything to look like you normally see it. But I'm going to hide that. This is the splash screen. It's just an opportunity for you to keep track of the things that you're actually doing. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and skip it for expediency. We click to begin, and we're given the option of looking at any of the 10 AVERT regions throughout the US. And in this case, I'm going to make the executive decision to look at the upper Midwest because it has a relatively small number of generators and loads fairly quickly. Once we've selected the area, we can either do that via a drop-down menu or actually click on the region itself. And we then need to double-click in this blue window over here, and that allows us to actually pull up the file that we will have downloaded from EPA in order to be able to, the regional data file that we will have pulled from EPA in order to actually run AVERT. So in this case, I pre-downloaded all of the 10 regional data files. Since I'm only running the upper Midwest, I really only need to pull that one, but I'll select it right now, and then I'll ask it to load. And so again, that's a file that I've already downloaded, and now I'm just going to pull it into the AVERT framework. There's a little status bar on the bottom that tells me that my computer's thinking about pulling that into AVERT, and that takes just a couple moments. This is a much faster process than overall going through the actual statistical module itself, which can take on the order of many minutes to many hours, depending on what region you're running. Once that loads up, it will have told us that we've successfully loaded the 2013 Upper Midwest regional data file, and that there are 318 units that are in this region. This region represents generation from Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And those states are represented in full. Every generator in those states is within this region. There are also a number of regions that are in this particular AVERT region, the states that are in this particular AVERT region that are only partially represented. So for example, only 61% of the generation from Illinois is represented in this AVERT region. The rest of it is in the Great Lakes Mid-Atlantic region. Same thing goes for Missouri. That's also split between the lower Midwest, the SPP area, and the upper Midwest. Mississippi, Montana, and Wisconsin are all split. And if you're in one of those states, then you actually need to run AVERT twice, and there's guidance in the user manual of how to do that for both halves of your state, because electrical regions do not necessarily cover state regions nicely. We then hit OK. We head on to the next spot, and now we're going to choose a energy efficiency or renewable energy profile that we actually want to run, and this is where it gets more fun. So there are a couple of different options that are offered in AVERT by default. The first thing you should know is that if you wanted to if you have your own energy efficiency profile or renewable energy profile that you want to test within AVERT, that's always preferential to using any of the defaults that are loaded into AVERT. We've provided these portfolios just for convenience. They're certainly useful for testing, but we certainly recommend that if you have better information, use it. So if you want to use better information, there's this nice green button over here that says Enter Hourly Data Manually. And when you click that, it brings up this long profile of 8,760 rows where you can drop in your energy efficiency and renewable energy right over here in this manual EERE profile spot. And you can just copy and paste it in. And if you do that, then you're set. Alternatively, you can use one of the defaults here. So one thing that we can do is look at a profile reduction, which says reduce some amount of generation off of our system that's equivalent to 1% of the existing fossil generation. So if I wanted to look at all 100 hours, or 100% of hours, all 8760 hours, and I wanted to look at say a 3% reduction off of that, I could put in 100% of all hours here and 3% reduction, and it shows me what that reduction would look like over here. If I wanted to only look at a smaller fraction, say peak hours, the top 10% of peak hours, I could restrict it to the top 10% of hours or the top 3% of hours. And I could look at deeper reductions instead of that smaller 3%. At the moment, I'm going to keep it at 3% and 100. We could also do a flat generation reduction, which would be the equivalent of, say, an industrial process or cooling load for chillers. And that might be something where we know that every hour we're going to avoid 200 megawatts worth of generation. And so we now have a flat line at the 200 megawatt spot. Alternatively, we could do renewable energy renewable energy programs, wind capacity. We could look at a range of wind profiles. In this case, it's pulling modeled data that are specific to the region. And the user manual describes the source of those data. And the same thing goes for PV profiles. And this profile over here contains 8760 hours in it. We can't necessarily see the details of what that looks like, but take it from me, you actually have an hourly profile associated with each one of those days in there. And, of course, you can layer things. So if we think we're going to have some amount of PV coming on and some amount of wind coming on, and also a chiller program coming online, and we think we're also going to do some amount of portfolio-based energy efficiency, that's going to be a combination of, say, lighting programs, refrigeration programs, industrial programs, just across the board, and we think it's going to tend to be slightly more peak-focused, but not necessarily exclusively. We could say we're going to 100% of those and say a 1.5% reduction over here. And now we have this profile that represents a combination of all of the different programs that we've pulled in over here. So that's going to be a little bit too much for right now. We're just going to keep this at this 3% profile. And I'm going to zero the rest of these out. And we're just going to go through with this simple profile of a hourly reduction that's equivalent to a profile energy efficiency program. I'm going to hit next over here. And it gives me this big green button that says calculate displaced emissions and generation. And I hit it, and once again, it's going to take just a couple moments for it to think its way through. After it goes through this, it's going to give me a number of options of menus that I can look at to parse through the data. And when we do that, we can look at it at the level of a county, at the level of the region, at the level of a state, or if we really wanted to look at advanced information, we can even get down to individual EGU basis. Although we don't generally recommend trying to parse it at the individual EGU basis unless you're doing specific air quality modeling. When I finished, I have this little button that comes up that says the calculation is now complete. I hit OK. And now we can move on to the displays. There are a number of options here. I'm not going to go through all of them for time. But there are some useful pieces here. So first block of outputs are summary tables that we can get for the data that we've just produced. We can also look at various charts and figures that are nicely illustrative. And finally, this box over here, we can actually generate data in smoke format to use in air quality models. And so that will generate smoke formatted files on a monthly basis for both before and after the energy efficiency or renewable energy program. So first, I'm going to just show an annual regional displacement. And the program that we put in place avoided approximately 7.5 terawatt hours worth of energy. And in doing so, avoided 21 million pounds of SO2, 12 million pounds of NOx, and 6.7 million tons of CO2, or that's at least the approximate in this case. And this gives us just a nice overview. If we go back here, we can also then look at where those displacements actually occurred. Look at this displaced emissions map. And this gives us a view of where those displaced generation occurred. Each dot over here represents an individual power plant. So there are conceptually 316 dots in the sequence sprinkled throughout the upper Midwest. Larger dots represent larger amounts of generation reductions, and darker dots represent multiple EGUs that are in the same location, all having displaced generation. We can also recast it by displaced SO2. Now we're seeing the reductions that occurred primarily at coal units, or we can look at changes in CO2, where we're representing the mix of units that have been displaced by this particular program. And then there are a number of other options that are in here as well, including looking specifically at ozone season and peak days. Go back to my outputs. There's a much more detailed mechanism where we can look at hourly displacements by week, which sounds like a lot at first, but it contains some quite interesting information. So we can look at what we actually displaced on an hourly basis in generation at a particular time of year. And so I'm going to look at the first month of July, or first week of July, and it will tell me that we displaced along this yellow line generation that was coincident with our peaks. Down over here, this tells me how much our total fossil load was on an hour-by-hour basis over the course of this week. And this yellow line over here is the displaced generation that we've had from our profile energy efficiency program. That yellow bar, or that yellow line, is filled up with blue bars, where the darker bars represent high-capacity factory units closer to baseload. The light bars are units that are closer to peaking units. And it shows me that I've got a displacement of both during my peak hours and almost primarily made up of my baseload units during my trough hours in this case. I could also recast that same information in terms of, say, SO2. and then I'm going to see where I'm primarily displacing SO2 on an hour-by-hour basis, or NOx, or CO2, or etc. Do the same thing for that as well. And if you hover over this, it will actually tell you which units are represented by the particular bar that you're looking at. Finally, you can look at the information on a county basis if you know about a particular county that you're concerned about. So I could go to annual displacement data by county first. Oh, I'm sorry. You can do monthly displacements by selected geography over here. So I could go to a county level, and I'm going to first look, for example, at Wisconsin and Dane County, which I know contains a number of gas units, and it tells me that those gas units are primarily displaced during the summer season. And so I would guess that primarily those are closer to peaking units. They're not displacing all that much SO2, or certainly not a lot of SO2, and not very much NOx and CO2 on a relative scale. I could also go take a look at, say, another county. Let's take a look at I don't know, Sherburne County, where there's, I think, a single power plant, coal-fired power plant in Sherburne, called Sherburne. And in this case, it's reducing just about every month of the year, and it tells us that we have moderately significant SO2, NOx, and CO2 emissions reductions based off of that. And then there's additional information in tabular form that you can get out of that. So all of the information that's output by AVERT is available on a monthly basis, even down to an hourly basis, although at some point the level of resolution is probably too fine to actually be meaningful. But AVERT does produce things on both a hourly basis and at an EG level. So there are lots of other outputs that we could look at from AVERT, but I'm going to close it out right there and return us back to our presentation for questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Jeremy. And thank you, Robyn. We do have a number of questions that I want to ask, so I'll jump right in. One has to do with updating of the files. Do you intend to keep the AVERT data files updated, and how frequently will that happen?
Hi, Warren, this is Robyn. I can take that question. And yes, we do plan to update AVERT files on an annual basis. And right now, the 2014 files are available. So the March of the preceding year will have data for the past year. So in March 2016, we'll have the 2015 data files available, and that's just so people are reporting the reported emissions and generation information to our EPA Clean Air Markets Division through our Air Markets Program data, and so we just need time to process that, QA/QC it, and then we have Synapse produce those data files for us, and we post them on our website by the end of March of the following year.
Good. And someone else was asking, this is open to the public and they're not connected to a local or a regional government. They're from a business. How might a business use this tool and benefit from it?
That's a good question. I guess it depends on what type of business it is. I mean, anyone in the public domain can use AVERT for their interests. So if there's someone who's not a state or local government, but maybe they want to promote the clean energy benefits of energy efficiency and renewable energy, they could use this tool to do that. Maybe they want to help make the case for doing more energy efficiency, renewable energy. So I would think that the business would need to be in the business of promoting energy efficiency or renewable energy to have use of the tool.
Yeah, and presumably if someone was, for example, of a renewable energy developer and they were proposing to, for example, build a large wind farm, they could come up with an estimate of what the emissions benefits of their wind farm would be.
Yeah, that would be a good example. And on the slides we talked about how Alliance to Save Energy, and I think they partnered with Hannon Armstrong to use AVERT to show to create this carbon count calculator. That's another example. Or the American Wind Energy Association wanted to show how much emission benefits are from the U.S. installing wind turbines from 2013. So those are another couple examples of organizations that are not state or local that could benefit from using the tool.
Great. And one of our listeners asked about how the CO2 emissions values for natural gas emissions were calculated. Are methane leakage from supply system included in that? Is it possible for a user to change the global warming potential values for natural gas?
This is Jeremy. I'll take that one.
I'll let Jeremy answer that one.
Sure, thanks. So the information that's provided in AVERT is stack emissions as reported to the Continuous Emissions Monitoring System. So it doesn't take into account upstream emissions from any fossil fuel in this case. The data really is exactly as reported. So if there's a unit, for example, that has a lower efficiency at a lower level of generation and therefore produces more CO2 at that lower level of generation on a per megawatt hour basis, that would be reflected in this data. But it's only reflected to the extent that it's at stack emissions. A user could theoretically go through the future year scenario template that's associated with this and modify the emissions rates for individual units to reflect their understanding of the information that they'd like to be reflected. Once those changes are made, they no longer reflect the base data that's provided by EPA. But those emissions rates can certainly be changed by users in the future year scenario template.
Good. And here's a question, and you could correct this person if their conclusions are incorrect, or answer them if they're not incorrect. And what this person writes is, what explains why wind seems to displace more coal than solar? It has higher rates of avoided CO2 and NOx, even in the south where the solar resource tends to be more on peak than wind. I guess gas is the peak resource, while energy efficiency and renewables dip into coal more easily when it performs off peak. Is that the explanation?
That's exactly right. We tend to find solar and our peak focused programs tend to displace more gas because there's more gas available during those peak hours. During the off-peak hours, particularly if you have areas where wind is an off-peak resource, or even if it's just random, it will tend to hammer more on off-peak hours than an on-peak solar program. And since we tend to find coal off-peak more often, both because it tends to be base load more often, but also because of its commitment, it just makes sense to keep it on more often once it's on, then we have a tendency to displace coal. And that explanation is not necessarily we're turning off coal altogether through the process of putting on additional wind in this case, but we could just be backing off units by a small fraction.
Good. Does AVERT account for changes in which units are on the margin as the penetration of efficiency and renewables increases? For example, in one particular hour, 1 megawatt of renewables might primarily displace a marginal combined gas cycle unit, but 1,000 megawatts in that same hour would start to dig into the stack and displace more coal and even nuclear. Does AVERT capture that dynamic?
That sounds like a very friendly softball question. And yes, that's actually one of the reasons that we designed AVERT. in the way that it's designed is to be able to capture the dynamic of the difference between small amounts of penetration versus large amounts of penetration. And so because of the way that AVERT is operating, it's actually looking at the change in generation and the change in generation that's required due to an energy efficiency renewable energy program, and looking at the not just if a unit is displaced or not, but is a unit displaced at the level of reduction that we're looking for. So it does exactly that. Larger programs will displace more units and more deeply. There was one other part of that question of would it even start to dig into nuclear units? There's an implicit assumption within AVERT that fossil units are exclusively displaced through energy efficiency and renewable energy programs on the operational margin. And that's basically that hydro units will operate for pricing purposes generally, and nuclear units generally don't make sense to ramp. And so between those, we would tend to find most of our marginal changes within the fossil fleet, and AVERT uses that as its assumption.
Good. Are there any other pollutants besides NOx, SOx, and CO2 that can be analyzed using this tool?
Yeah, this is Robyn. For now, those are the only pollutants. We have gotten requests to look into PM 2.5 directly. You know, one of the issues we have is that PM 2.5 isn't directly reported to us through the continuous emissions monitoring data. So we're looking into some workarounds so that PM 2.5 could be represented in AVERT. So stay tuned for that maybe in 2016.
Okay. And is there a minimum nameplate capacity for a unit to be included in the data file?
So units that are included in the data file have to be reporting to the SEMS system in the first place, the continuous emissions monitoring system. And that can be found either through data that we provide on the AVERT website as to whether units included or excluded, or through the Air Markets Program data set from CAMD. It's generally around a 25 megawatt threshold, although there are some smaller units that do report as well. And then within AVERT, we have a cutoff that we've generally used for some of the data files that are produced of a unit has to have produced 1,000 megawatts within a year. And that's just a cutoff to prevent units that only produce 1 hour of the year from being included in the statistical data set. Because frankly, trying to figure out whether a unit that produced during an hour or 2 hours is statistically meaningful is a not particularly meaningful question.
And can the data be downloaded into Excel for the Mac? Is it available for Macs? And if so, what's the latest Mac version it will run on?
I actually don't know how AVERT main module runs in Mac. I've heard mixed reviews depending on what you're running within Mac to be able to emulate the Microsoft system. The statistical module does not run in the Macintosh environment and only runs on a Windows environment. And that's just due to a restriction based off of both what we have as computational ability here and what's produced by MATLAB.
Could AVERT be used to show the emissions difference of replacing an aging gas-fired facility with a modern, more efficient one? And even if AVERT could be used for that purpose, would it make sense to use it for that purpose?
It's a great question. So would it make sense to use it for that purpose? It wouldn't be the best use of AVERT. Really what we'd want to use AVERT for is looking for larger scale changes in the system where the difference of a single unit or 2 units even is generally too small to be showing anything that's meaningful in the system. And so to do that type of unit analysis, you'd probably want to use software that's more distinctly designed for looking at production cost, or even just simple spreadsheets that are tuned towards trying to figure out precisely that question on one or two units. In terms of whether you could actually do it or not, you could. Within the future year scenario template, there are mechanisms that you can use to retire and add new units. So you could retire a unit that you didn't want to have in existence and bring around a unit that you did want to have in existence, and then look at how the system operates from those, although the information that you'd get off of that analysis wouldn't necessarily answer the question I think that's being asked. But I think if somebody's pursuing that question, I'd encourage them to get in touch through the EPA's helpline on this, and we can try to hone in on that a little bit better.
Good. I'm going to ask just one last question and then give Robyn and Jeremy an opportunity to say anything that they wish they had said and they haven't said up till now. And also as a reminder, if you had questions that I haven't gone to, I'm sure Jeremy or Robyn would be happy to answer them if you were to contact them directly. But the last question I was going to ask, is there any way to use the tool for modeling the emissions impacts of combined heat and power?
So it's a good question. It's one that we receive a lot. So it sort of depends on what's meant by that. If we think of a combined heat and power station as one that is effectively dispatched for purposes other than electrical generation, then we should be able to come up with effectively a profile of that combined heat and power station and be able to put that profile in, that energy profile, into our system in the same way that we'd otherwise put in a renewable energy or energy efficiency profile. Having done that, we could get the emissions that were otherwise avoided by putting in that CHP unit, but then we'd also have to account for the additional incremental emissions that we get from that CHP unit. So as long as you're taking all of those steps into account, AVERT is a mechanism that you can start to use to do that. Again, it goes back to the question of you'd want to make sure that you're doing this for a unit that's of substantial enough size that you're actually making a notable difference on the system. Otherwise, we're in an area where AVERT just is too broad scale.
Good. So, Robyn or Jeremy, is there anything else you want to say before we close the webinar?
Yeah, this is Robyn. Warren, I just wanted to thank you and your colleagues at Clean Energy State Alliance for having us on the call today. And I encourage anyone who's interested in using AVERT, we do have a new online training that the link's on the last slide of our slide deck. So please take a look at that. And if you email avert@epa.gov, that email address goes directly to me. It's just a good way to keep track of AVERT inquiries. So feel free to use that, and we'll get back to you within 48 hours or so. So thank you.
Jeremy, you have any famous last words?
No, thank you very much for having us today. And if you have any questions for us directly, whether it's AVERT related or Synapse related, feel free to get in touch with us via the same mechanism.
Hey, thanks very much, both Jeremy and Robyn. This tool is really neat and very useful, and I'm sure a lot of states are going to find increased use for it now that they know more about it. So thanks all, and we will be having more webinars in the future.